She had buried his name for 5 years, buried it under late-night shifts, under the laughter of her two children, under the ashes of a love she once thought would last forever. But tonight, when the restaurant door burst open in the December snowstorm, the man who walked in was no longer a ghost of memory. He was real. He stood there. And the two children wiping tables at her feet, two children with his gray eyes, didn't yet know that their lives had just changed forever. If you're reading this story, please like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far my story has traveled in this world. Now, let's begin. The snow had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, and by 9 it had buried the sidewalks of lower Manhattan under 8 inches of silence. The kind of silence that made the city feel like something out of a dream or a warning. The streetlights along Carmine Street smeared orange through the frosted glass of Aldo's, and inside, the last 2 tables were finishing their wine, taking their time the way people always did when the weather turned ugly, and going outside meant something. Serafina Vale was wiping down the bar when she heard Rowan drop a fork. "Pick it up," she said without turning around. "I did." "Then put it in the bus bin, not back on the table." She could hear the eye roll in his silence. He was 7 years old and already had the attitude of someone who'd been wronged by the universe on principle. She didn't know where he got it. That was a lie. She knew exactly where he got it. Ivy was more careful. She always had been. Quieter, watchful, the kind of child who stood in doorways and observed rooms before entering them. She was folding napkins at table 4 with a precision that bordered on unsettling for a second grader, her dark hair falling across her face as she worked. When she looked up and caught her mother watching, she smiled, and Serafina felt it like a fist around her sternum. That smile. God, that smile belonged to someone else entirely. "Mom, can we get hot chocolate after?" Rowan asked. "It's almost 9:30. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting. Marco, the owner, was counting the register near the host stand. He was 64 and shaped like a wine barrel, and had been feeding Serafina free pasta since the night she'd shown up 3 months pregnant, soaked through from the rain, asking about the waitress position taped to the window. That had been 5 years ago. He'd never asked about the father. She'd never offered. It was the best professional arrangement she'd ever had. "Go ahead and cut out early," Marco said without looking up from the bills. "Weather's getting worse." "I can stay and close." "Sarah." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "Take your kids home." She opened her mouth to argue. The extra hour mattered. It always mattered. But Rowan was already pulling on his coat with the enthusiasm of someone released from prison, and Ivy was carefully stacking the last of the folded napkins into a perfect pile. So Serafina let it go. She walked to the back to grab her own coat, and that was when she heard it. The front door. Not the usual sound of it. The scrape and jingle as someone ducked in from the cold. This was different. The door opened slowly, deliberately, and the blast of winter air that came with it reached all the way to the back hallway where Serafina stood with her coat half on. She heard Marco say something. Heard a voice respond, low, male, the kind of voice that had weight to it. She walked back out. Later, she would not be able to explain what she felt in that first second. It wasn't recognition exactly. It was more like the moment before lightning, that charged stillness when every hair on your arm stands up and your body knows something your brain is still catching up to. He was standing inside the doorway, snow melting off the shoulders of a dark overcoat that probably cost more than her monthly rent. 2 men behind him. Big, quiet, the kind of quiet that was actually a profession. His back was to her. He was saying something to Marco about whether the kitchen was still open, and Marco was doing the thing he did when he was trying to be polite to someone he couldn't quite read, which was talk too much about the specials. Then he turned. Damien Moretti had not aged the way she'd expected. He hadn't softened. If anything, he'd hardened into something more precise, the way a blade looks after years of being properly maintained. The jaw was the same. The mouth was the same. The eyes, gray and direct and unsettlingly still, were exactly the same eyes she had looked into the night she'd told him she was pregnant, the night she'd sent him 14 messages he'd never answered, the night she'd finally understood that she was alone. Those eyes found her across the room. Neither of them moved. Serafina became aware of two things simultaneously. First, her hands had gone cold inside her coat pockets. Second, Rowan had wandered out from behind table 5 and was standing in the open, looking up at this stranger the way 7-year-old boys looked at things they found interesting and slightly dangerous. "Rowan." Her voice came out steady. She didn't know how. "Come here." He didn't move. He was staring at Damien with that particular Rowan intensity, head tilted slightly, and Damien had stopped looking at Serafina. He was looking at Rowan now, and the expression on his face had changed into something she couldn't name, something that cracked through the composure like ice giving way. "Rowan." Harder this time. He came. She put her hand on his shoulder and pulled him against her side, and then Ivy materialized beside her too, quiet as always, and the three of them stood there in the warm yellow light of Aldo's Italian kitchen while the snow piled up against the glass, and Damien Moretti looked at her children. She watched him do the math. She watched the exact moment it landed. "We're closed," Serafina said. The words tasted like cardboard. "Kitchen's done." Marco looked between them with the expression of a man who sensed a situation he wanted no part of. Let me just get the, He disappeared toward the back with remarkable speed for someone his age. Damien's men had stopped in the doorway. Nobody had spoken. The snow ticked against the windows. Rowan, blessedly, was absorbed in the buttons of his own coat. Ivy was watching Damien the way she watched everything, still taking inventory. "Serafina," Damien said, just her name. Nothing attached to it, but it hit her the way her name and his voice had always hit her, somewhere low and involuntary, and she hated herself for it. "You need to leave," she said. "I need you to look at me." "I am looking at you." "Then stop looking at me like I'm someone you don't know." She glanced at the kids. Rowan had finally noticed the tension. His head came up, eyes moving between his mother and this stranger. Ivy hadn't stopped watching Damien since he'd walked in. "Kids?" Serafina kept her voice even. "Go wait by the back door. Marco will let you stand in the kitchen." "Why?" "Rowan, now!" He went, dragging his feet, pulling Ivy with him by the sleeve. The door to the kitchen swung shut behind them. The restaurant was suddenly very quiet. Just the two of them and Damien's men standing like furniture near the entrance, and the snow outside doing what snow did. Damien took a step toward her. "Stop," she said. He stopped. 5 years of practiced silence rose up in her throat. All the things she'd rehearsed saying if this moment ever came. The cool explanations, the controlled anger, the absolute refusal to let him see anything on her face that he hadn't earned. She'd been over it 1,000 times in the small hours, nursing one child or the other, running through it like lines for a play she never planned to perform. She had it down. She was ready. She said none of it. What came out instead was, "How did you find this place?" "I didn't," he said. "I was in the neighborhood." "You were in the neighborhood. There's a meeting 2 blocks from here. We needed somewhere to eat." Something moved through his expression quickly, like a shadow crossing water. "I didn't know you were here." She studied his face for the lie. It wasn't there. That almost made it worse. "You need to go," she said again. "Sarah, don't." The word came out sharp. "Don't call me that. You don't get to call me that." He absorbed this without flinching. That was new. The Damien she'd known had flinched. He'd been young and hungry and volatile in a way that was electric when it was aimed at the world and devastating when it turned inward. This man in front of her, whatever he'd become, whatever the last 5 years had made him, he didn't flinch. That frightened her more than anything else about him. "The boy," he said very quietly. His eyes. "Don't." And the girl's Damien. His name in her mouth after 5 years was a strange foreign object. "If you walk out that door right now, we can both pretend this didn't happen." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw tightened. She could see him doing something deliberate with himself, pulling something back, getting control of whatever had broken open behind his eyes in the moment he'd seen Rowan standing there. "I'll go," he said finally. She exhaled. "But I'm coming back." She didn't answer. He held her gaze for another second, then turned and walked out into the snow, his men falling in behind him, and the door swung shut and the jingle of the bell above it seemed absurdly cheerful for the moment. Serafina stood very still. Then she walked to the nearest chair and sat down because her legs had made the decision for her. She sat there for 3 minutes by the clock above the bar. Then she got up, got her children from the kitchen, ignoring Rowan's questions with the glazed efficiency of someone in mild shock, and wrapped them in their coats and hats and walked them out into the snow. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. The street was almost empty. The snow muffled everything. She could see fresh tire tracks in the white, wide, heavy, an SUV or something bigger, pulling away from the curb and disappearing around the corner, and she stood there watching the empty space where they'd been until Ivy tugged her hand. "Mama, you're not moving." "I know." She pulled her daughter close and started walking. "I know, baby." She told herself the whole 4 blocks home that it was over, that she'd handled it, that he'd said he was going to come back, but people said things. People said all kinds of things. She'd believed every word out of Damien Moretti's mouth once, and look how that had ended. Alone in a hospital room at 2 in the morning, 2 newborns in her arms, and 0 messages returned, understanding in the fluorescent silence that some things you couldn't come back from. She got the kids upstairs, ran baths, made Rowan eat the rest of his dinner from earlier because he'd claimed at Aldo's that he wasn't hungry and she wasn't letting him learn that trick. Read Ivy 2 chapters of her book. Sat on the edge of Rowan's bed until he fell asleep, which took longer than usual because he wanted to ask about the man in the restaurant, and she told him it was nobody, just a customer, and he gave her a look that said he was 7, not stupid, but he let it go. When both kids were asleep, she went to the kitchen and sat at the small table by the window and watched the snow fall on the fire escape. She'd been so careful. That was the thing. 5 years of carefully maintaining the kind of unremarkable life that didn't attract attention. The same neighborhood, the same job, the same modest building with the super who minded his business. She hadn't looked for Damien. She hadn't looked up his name in the papers even when she'd heard it starting to surface, even when one of the other waitresses had shown her a photo on her phone of the Moretti family and said something about how dangerous they were. Serafina had looked at the photo just long enough to confirm it was him, and then she'd handed back the phone and gone back to refilling bread baskets. She'd buried it. She was good at that. She got up and checked the locks on the front door, checked the window locks, stood in the hallway between her bedroom and the kids' room for a moment, listening to them breathe. Then she went and sat back down at the kitchen table and thought about what he'd said. "I'm coming back." The thing about Damien Moretti, the things she'd known about him when she was 22 and in love with him, and too young to understand what she was getting near, was that he didn't say things he didn't mean. Not to her. That had been both the gift and the problem. When he said forever, he meant it. When he said, "I'll find a way," he was already looking. When he said he was coming back, she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. He didn't know yet. Not for certain. He'd seen the eyes, the smile. He was smart enough to do the math. She'd watched him do it in real time. But he didn't know. And there was a version of tomorrow where she could still contain this. Call Marco in the morning, ask for a schedule shift to a different location. Maybe the uptown location, the one on the west side. Start varying her route. Keep the kids' routine tight and private. A version of tomorrow where she didn't have to say the words out loud. He's their father. She hadn't said those words to anyone, not to Marco. Not to her sister in Portland, who thought the twins' father was some guy who'd left before they were born. Not to the pediatrician who'd once, gently, asked about family medical history, and she'd manufactured answers so smoothly that she'd almost believed them herself. The words had lived only in her own head for 5 years, locked down in the part of her that she didn't open, because opening it meant feeling what was in there. And what was in there was a specific mixture of grief and fury and love so badly curdled it had turned into something else entirely. Something she had no clean name for. She was still sitting there, hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea she'd forgotten to drink, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it. It buzzed again. She answered it because she'd always been more reckless than she looked. "I need to talk to you," Damien said. "Not like that. Not in front of them." "How did you get this number?" A pause. "Does it matter?" It tells me a lot about who you've become. I've become a lot of things. His voice was very controlled. Whatever he'd felt in that restaurant, he'd sealed it back up. I need you to meet me. Tomorrow. Somewhere you choose. I'm not meeting you anywhere. Sarah, I told you not to. Serafina. Her full name clipped and careful. Please. She'd expected demand, threat, command. All the tools of the man he'd apparently grown into, the one the papers talked about in careful language that danced around what he actually was. She had not expected please. It caught her somewhere unguarded. There's nothing to talk about, she said. We both know that's not true. She stood up and walked to the window. Down below, the street was white and still. A single cab moved slowly through the intersection, headlights diffused by the falling snow. Who knows you found me? She asked. Another pause, longer. Why? Because you walking into that restaurant wasn't random. I believe you. I actually believe you didn't know I was there. But the fact that you're in this neighborhood at all, she stopped, rearranged the thought. Does anyone know about tonight? About what you saw? Just me. Your men. They work for me. That's not the reassurance you think it is. Silence, then, very quietly. You're scared. I'm careful. Of me? She considered lying. She'd gotten very good at it over the years. Not cruel lies, just the practical kind. The ones that kept her children safe and her life intact. She could lie to him right now, and he'd probably let it stand. Not of you specifically, she said. Of what comes with you. He didn't answer for a long moment. The snow fell. Somewhere down the hall, Rowan made a small sound in his sleep, some dream argument he was winning, and Serafina's chest tightened with the specific terror of a mother who has just invited attention she cannot control toward the two most important people in her world. Tomorrow, Damien said. You name the place. You have my number now. He hung up. She stood at the window for a long time after that, watching the snow erase everything. The footprints, the tire tracks, the evidence of a night that had just ended one version of her carefully constructed life and started something else entirely. She didn't know what it was yet. She knew it wasn't safe. She knew she wasn't going to sleep. She also knew, with the particular clarity that came from years of surviving things she hadn't expected to survive, that Damien Moretti coming back was not the most dangerous part of this. The most dangerous part was that somewhere in the locked room she never opened, something she'd thought was dead had moved. She turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark and breathed. In the kids' room, Ivy murmured something in her sleep. A word Serafina couldn't catch. But she stood there in the hallway and listened to her daughter breathe, and she thought about gray eyes, and she thought about what it meant that she hadn't already deleted that phone number. She thought about it for a long time. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, covering everything. By morning, there would be no trace of anyone having stood in the street below. No tracks. No evidence. But Serafina Vale had spent 5 years knowing that the absence of evidence wasn't the same as safety. And tomorrow, when she looked at her children across the breakfast table, Rowan arguing about something, Ivy arranging her cereal with mathematical precision, she was going to have to decide how much longer she could hold the wall, because Damien had seen their eyes. And a man like the one he'd become did not walk away from something like that. Not willingly, not ever. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the building settle around her. The pipes groaning, the radiator ticking, the muffled sound of someone's television 2 floors up. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. She'd gotten good at that particular exercise over the years. It had kept her alive, or something close to alive. It had kept her moving. At 5:30, she gave up and made coffee. By 6, she had gone through the meeting 17 times in her head. All the possible versions. The one where she stayed calm and controlled. The one where she didn't. The one where Damien said something that cracked her open in front of him, which was the version she was most afraid of, because she'd spent 5 years mortaring that crack shut, and she was not going to let him watch it give way in some coffee shop while the morning light came through the windows. Rowan appeared in the kitchen at 6:40, hair destroyed, wearing 1 sock. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." He climbed onto the counter stool and looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "Is it about the man from last night?" She set down her mug. "What makes you ask that?" "You have your thinking face. I have one face, Rowan. You have like five." He held up fingers. "There's normal face. There's I'm annoyed at you face. There's someone said something dumb at work face. And there's the thinking face, which is the one you have now, which is different from all the others because you're not really looking at anything." She looked at him. 7 years old, sharp as wire. "Eat some cereal," she said. He ate cereal. She drank her coffee. The snow outside had stopped overnight and left the world white and flat and very quiet. And Serafina watched the fire escape frost and thought about what she was going to say to a man she hadn't spoken to in 5 years. A man who now commanded the kind of respect that was really just fear with a better suit on. A man who had looked at her son's face last night and understood something that she had not given him permission to understand. She texted the number at 7:15. A coffee place in Tribeca she knew. Public, populated even in the morning. 3 exits she'd already counted in her memory. Neutral ground, or as close to it as anything involving Damien Moretti could get. His response came in 11 seconds. One word, fine. She dropped the kids at school herself, walked them to the door, which she didn't always do. Usually Rowan led them both, already annoyed at the pace she walked. And she watched them go in, watched the door close behind them, and stood on the wet sidewalk for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Ivy had turned back at the door, given her a look. The kind of look her daughter had been giving her since she was 4. A look that was too old for the face wearing it. A look that said, "I see more than you think I do." Serafina had waved. Then she'd turned and walked toward the subway and whatever came next. The coffee place was called Bell and Ground, a narrow storefront with exposed brick and the smell of burned milk and the ambient noise of people who had somewhere important to be. She got there 10 minutes early, found a table in the back corner where she could see both the door and the counter, ordered a black coffee she didn't need and wrapped her hands around the cup and waited. He walked in at exactly the time she'd said, which was somehow worse than if he'd been late. The 2 men from last night were not with him. He was alone, or he appeared alone, which was not the same thing, but she didn't see anyone positioned near the exits, and she'd been watching since she arrived. He wore a charcoal jacket, no tie, and he looked like someone who had also not slept, though on him it looked different, harder, like the sleeplessness had compressed him into something denser. He saw her, crossed the room without stopping at the counter, pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired. I didn't sleep either." "I don't need to know that." He was looking at her steadily. She'd forgotten, or made herself forget, how he did that. How he gave his full attention to a thing without flinching from it, the way most people flinched from things that were uncomfortable. It had been disarming when she was young. It was still disarming now, which annoyed her. "Ask what you came to ask," she said. "You know what I'm going to ask. Then ask it out loud." He put his hands flat on the table. "Are they mine?" The coffee place hummed around them. The espresso machine screamed briefly. Someone laughed near the window. "Yes," she said. He didn't move. His face didn't move. But something happened behind his eyes, some tectonic shift that she felt rather than saw, a kind of pressure change in the air between them. And she watched him absorb it, the whole weight of what that word contained, watched him hold it the way a person holds something that is both exactly what they expected and completely unbearable anyway. "Rowan and Ivy," he said. "Yes." 7 years old. "Yes." He looked down at the table. His jaw was working. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet, and she hadn't expected that. She'd expected anger, recrimination, the cold, controlled fury she'd seen in the papers and heard about through enough second-hand sources to build a portrait. She had not expected his eyes to go wet in a Tribeca coffee shop at 7:50 in the morning. She looked away first. "Why?" he said. The word came out stripped. Not an accusation yet. Not quite. Just the raw underside of 5 years. "You know why." "I want to hear your version." "My version." She turned back to look at him. "My version is that I sent you 14 messages. I called your number 9 times. I went to the apartment on Barrow Street, and the woman who answered said you'd moved out. I tried your cousin's number, and it was disconnected. She said it flat and even, the way she'd practiced it, the way she'd rehearsed it in the small hours for years. 2 weeks after I found out I was pregnant, I got a text from your number. It said, "Stop. I made my choice. Don't contact me again." He stared at her. "I never sent that." "I know that now." "What do you mean, you know that now?" "I mean, I believed it then." She tightened her hands around the cup. "I was 22 and I was scared, and I was alone, and the man I loved had just, as far as I understood it, told me we were done. So I made a decision." She held his gaze. "I made a decision to make sure my children were safe. That was the only decision I was capable of making." He was very still. "Who sent that text?" "I don't know." "You don't know, or you don't want to tell me?" "I genuinely don't know, Damien. I've had 5 years to think about it, and I don't know." She paused. "Someone who had access to your phone or your number. Someone who wanted you to disappear from my life." Something crossed his face, fast and cold. "What?" she said. "Nothing." That was not nothing. "Let me think." He said it quietly, more to himself than to her, and she watched him do the things she remembered. The way he turned a problem in his hands, methodical and private, while his expression closed down to something unreadable. She'd always found that maddening. She found it maddening now. "There was a man," he said slowly. "His name isn't important. He worked for my father. He was supposed to be managing communications for me during a particularly bad period, the spring, 5 years ago, when the Caruso situation was at its worst. He had access to everything." He stopped. "He died 18 months after that. Some people thought it was an accident." Serafina looked at him. "Do you think it was an accident?" "No." The weight of that single syllable sat between them. "So someone on your own side," she said. "Someone who thought separating us was in the family's interest." His voice had gone very flat. "Keeping me focused. Keeping me clear of complications." Complications. She felt the word like a slap, even though she knew he wasn't aiming it at her. The situation she'd been in, 22 years old and pregnant and alone, had been somebody's calculation, a line item in someone else's crisis management. "You need to understand something," she said. "What I'm about to say isn't an invitation." "All right. Knowing the truth doesn't change anything structurally. My life is what it is. My kids' lives are what they are. They don't know about you. They don't know anything about you. And I am not going to let them get dragged into—" She stopped, chose words. "Whatever it is you are now." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with those wet, controlled eyes, and he was quiet for long enough that the espresso machine had time to scream again. "I'm their father," he said, "biologically. That's not a small thing." "No, but it's also not everything. You don't get to decide that alone anymore." He said it without heat, but it landed like something with heat. "You made that decision alone 5 years ago, and I understand why. I'm not here to accuse you, but it's different now. I know. And I'm not a man who walks away from what's his." What's his? The possessive landed wrong, and he must have seen it on her face because he amended it almost immediately. "From what matters to me," he said. "That's what I meant." "I know what you meant the first time." "Serafina? I have to get to work." She stood, picked up her coat. "I need time to think. You need to understand that coming to my job, coming to my neighborhood—" "I told you I didn't know." "You know now." She looked at him. "Give me a week." "A week?" The word came out like he was testing the weight of it. "To think about what? Whether to let me be in their lives?" "To think about how this happens without destroying everything I've built." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was doing something unflattering to both of them, she thought, showing the years, the weight of things. She watched him decide something. 3 days, he said. "Fine. 3 days." She put her coat on. "Don't come to the restaurant." She left before he could respond. Walked out into the cold morning air and kept walking, didn't look back, kept her steps even and her spine straight until she turned a corner and found a doorway and stood in it for 30 seconds, pressing her back against the cold brick and breathing through her nose. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them like they belonged to someone else. Then she made them stop and walked to the subway. The next 2 days were a particular kind of purgatory. She worked. She made lunches and oversaw homework and refereed the ongoing border dispute between Rowan's Legos and Ivy's area of the bedroom floor. She smiled at Marco across the bar and refilled wine glasses and recommended the pappardelle to couples who weren't paying attention to her anyway. She did all the normal things. And she watched the door. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone would notice, but she watched it. The slight tension in her shoulders every time it opened, the half-second of assessment before she clocked the face and let herself breathe. And she knew that she had not actually believed him when he'd promised to stay away from the restaurant. Not because she thought he was lying, because she'd started to understand that Damien's presence in the world was not something that politely respected boundaries she'd drawn. He didn't come, which was almost worse, because waiting for something that didn't happen was its own kind of erosion. On the third day, walking home from school with the kids, she let herself imagine it. The careful version. The version where Damien was introduced slowly, carefully, maybe as someone who knew her from before, a work contact, someone peripheral. And the twins adjusted gradually, and the whole thing was managed with the kind of deliberate control that she'd used to manage everything for 5 years. She was imagining this, walking past the shuttered dry cleaner on the corner of her block, when Ivy said, very quietly, "Mama, that car has been parked there since we left school." Serafina looked. Black SUV, engine running. She could see the exhaust in the cold air. Windows tinted past the legal limit. Parked half a block up. "You didn't see it when we left the school?" Serafina kept her voice perfectly even. "It was on the other side then." 7 years old, and she clocked a tail. Serafina thought, not for the first time, that her daughter was going to be either a detective or a problem. "Okay, babe." She took Ivy's hand, took Rowan's. "We're going to walk a little faster, all right?" "Why?" "Because it's cold. Come on." She didn't go home. She turned left instead of right at the corner and walked 3 blocks north to the coffee shop she used occasionally to make herself feel like she had leisure time. She pushed through the door and found a table in the back and sat the kids down and got out her phone. She texted the number she'd been not texting for 3 days. Black SUV. "My block, not yours." The response came in 4 seconds. "Not mine." "Where are you?" She typed the address. Her hands were not shaking this time. They were very steady, which was a different kind of bad. "Stay inside, don't leave. I'm 12 minutes away." She looked up at her kids. Rowan was already asking why they'd come here instead of going home. Ivy was looking at the window with that too-old expression again, watching something outside that she wasn't sharing. "Who are you texting?" Rowan asked. "Nobody important," Serafina said. And then she thought about what was coming and looked at her son's gray eyes and added quietly, "Actually, that's not true." He looked at her. For a moment, he was simply a 7-year-old boy in a winter coat with hot chocolate offered and declined twice this week, watching his mother do something he couldn't fully understand. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Serafina looked at the door. "Something is changing," she said. "That's different." Damien arrived in 11 minutes. He came through the door and she recognized the controlled urgency in the way he moved. Fast, but not rushed. The distinction between someone who panicked and someone who'd learned that panic cost time. He scanned the room, found her in the back, and crossed to the table. And when he got there, he was looking at her, but she watched him look. Very briefly, just one glance but burning with everything, at the 2 small people sitting across from her. At Rowan. At Ivy. His children, seeing him for the first time with knowledge in the room between them instead of ignorance, even if the knowledge was only hers and his. "I have 2 men on the block," he said, keeping his voice low. He sat down. "The SUV is registered to a shell company out of Delaware. That's not random." His jaw was tight. "I know who this is. Tell me." He looked at her. Something in his face said he was calculating how much to give her. She recognized that calculation. She had seen it 5 years ago in a different context. and it still made her want to reach across whatever was between them and demand the rest. "There's a syndicate," he said. "We've been in conflict for 8 months. They've been pushing against our operations on the waterfront. I've been—" He glanced at the kids, calibrated, managing it. "But 3 weeks ago, they tried something that escalated things significantly. I've been expecting retaliation. And now they're parked on my block." "Yes." "Which means someone told them about last night, about the restaurant." He didn't answer, which was an answer. "Your men," she said. "I'm handling it." "Damien." She leaned forward, kept her voice very quiet, felt the particular cold focus that she'd learned to access when something genuinely threatened her children. "If someone on your side gave them my address, then my children are already a target, right now, before any of this is managed." He held her gaze. "I know. Then you understand that I cannot send them home tonight." "I have a place," he said. "Secure. On the Hudson. I've had it for 3 years, and the number of people who know about it is no. Sarah, I am not taking my children to a Mafia safe house. It's not a—" He stopped. The word had landed, and they both heard it. "It's a private residence, heavily secured, and right now it is the safest place in this city for them." She looked at her kids. Rowan was watching them with undisguised fascination, half his hot chocolate gone, Legos forgotten. Ivy had her chin on her hand and was watching Damien the way she'd watched him in the restaurant. That careful, unblinking inventory that Serafina found equal parts comforting and heartbreaking. "Who are you?" Rowan asked Damien. Damien looked at him, at those gray eyes that were his eyes, at the face that held his jawline and his mother's mouth, and something that was entirely its own thing. He looked at Rowan for a long moment without speaking. "I knew your mom," he said, "a long time ago, before you were born." Rowan processed this. "Are you the reason she had her thinking face this morning?" Something moved through Damien's expression, not quite a smile. "Probably." "She had it for 2 days," Rowan said fairly. Serafina put her hand over her eyes briefly. 2 days, Damien said. "That sounds about right." Outside, past the fogged coffee shop window, a second black SUV had appeared at the far end of the street. It parked. It did not move. Serafina saw it before Damien did. She watched it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and when he saw her face, he turned and looked, and the last of whatever choice she'd been protecting died quietly between them. "Okay," she said. He looked back at her. "Your place on the Hudson," she said, "just until this is handled. And I mean handled, not managed, not contained, handled." She held his gaze, and at the first moment that it's safe, we go back to our life, our regular life, with no black SUVs and no— "Sarah," he said it gently, but it stopped her. "When we get there, I need to tell you something you need to know about who is behind this." He paused. "It changes the shape of this conversation. It changes a lot of things." She looked at him. "What is it?" she said. He glanced at the kids. "Not here." She held his gaze for a moment longer, reading him, the tightness around his eyes, the particular controlled stillness he'd adopted that she was learning again, relearning, the vocabulary of a face she'd once known better than her own. There was something in there that was more than operational threat, something personal, something that had been sitting in him since that moment in the coffee shop when she'd told him about the text, about the person who'd intercepted everything, and his face had done the thing she hadn't let herself fully register until now. He already knew something. He'd known something since this morning, and he'd been holding it. Outside, the second SUV's engine was still running. "All right," she said quietly. She started gathering the kids' things, the casual efficiency of a mother who moved them through the world every day, but her hands were tight and her breathing was controlled in the way that meant she was working at it. "All right, let's go." She was already on her feet when she understood, fully and with the cold clarity of someone who'd spent 5 years building walls against exactly this, that they had just crossed a threshold that had no door behind it. There was no version of tonight that ended with her and the kids back in their apartment on their own terms. The life she'd built, the careful, quiet, unremarkable life she'd constructed from wreckage, was already changing shape around her, and the man sitting across from her, The man she'd loved and lost and grieved and buried was the only thing standing between her children and whatever was waiting outside in those black SUVs. And he was about to tell her something that would change the shape of everything. She could feel it coming the way she'd felt the lightning before, that charged pressure in the air, the body knowing before the brain. She picked up her daughter's scarf from the back of the chair, put it around Ivy's neck, smoothed it down. Ivy looked up at her. "It's okay," Serafina said, because she was a mother before she was anything else, and some lies were the ones you told because the truth hadn't finished forming yet. "I know," Ivy said, and she said it with such absolute certainty, in her small, clear voice, that Serafina almost believed her. The estate sat above the Hudson like something that had grown there rather than been built. Stone and glass and deliberate silence, tucked behind a private road off Route 9W that didn't appear on any mapping application Serafina had ever used. She noted that, filed it. The drive had taken 40 minutes, 2 vehicles, and enough route changes that she'd lost track of their direction somewhere around the George Washington Bridge, which she suspected was intentional. Rowan had fallen asleep against the window before they crossed into New Jersey. Ivy had stayed awake the entire time, watching the dark highway unspool through the glass, not asking questions. That was the thing about Ivy that Serafina found hardest to hold. She never asked questions she'd already answered for herself. The house had staff, quiet people who materialized and took their bags and showed them to rooms on the second floor without making eye contact. The children's room had bunk beds with clean sheets and a basket of things, books, a deck of cards, 2 small stuffed animals that still had tags on them. And when Serafina saw that basket, she understood that some preparation had happened between Damien's 12-minute arrival at the coffee shop and now, and the understanding of that made something cold move through her that wasn't entirely fear. She got the kids into bed. Rowan didn't fully wake up, just transferred from the car to the bunk with the boneless compliance of the deeply asleep. Ivy brushed her teeth and lay down and looked at the ceiling. "That man is important," Ivy said. "Go to sleep." He kept looking at Rowan. "Ivy." "Okay." She turned on her side, closed her eyes, then, almost too quietly to hear, "He looked at me too, when he thought I wasn't watching." Serafina stood in the doorway for a moment after that, her hand on the frame, the low light from the hallway falling across her daughter's already still form. Then she pulled the door mostly closed and walked downstairs. Damien was in a room off the main hallway, a study or something like it, walls of books that looked red rather than decorative, a desk that was covered in organized paper. He was standing at the window with a glass of water, looking out at the river. The Hudson was a dark seam in the darker night, barely visible, a suggestion of something moving. He heard her come in, didn't turn around immediately. "They're down," she said. "Good. Tell me." He turned then, set the glass down, and she saw it again. Whatever had been sitting in him since the coffee shop that morning, that specific weight behind his eyes that wasn't just the operational stress of 2 black SUVs and a compromised location. This was older. She could feel the age of it. He crossed to the desk, picked up a photograph from a folder that had been sitting open and held it out to her. She took it. The photograph showed a man she didn't know, 50s, heavy across the shoulders, the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into something more useful than handsome. He was getting out of a car. The photo had the slightly grainy quality of surveillance work. "His name is Victor Creel," Damien said. "He runs an organization called the Aldrin Group out of Boston. They've been moving south for 2 years, trying to absorb waterfront operations from Hartford to Baltimore. We've been blocking them." "I don't know this man." "No, but you know someone who works for him." Damien reached into the folder and produced a second photograph. She took it. The cold came fast and total, the way cold came when your body understood something before your mind gave it permission to. The man in the second photograph was younger, leaner, a face she knew, a face she had sat across from at a kitchen table 6 months after the twins were born, drinking terrible coffee and accepting the kind of help that proud people accepted when they had run out of other options. A face that had shown up, steady and unremarkable, at enough moments over the past 5 years that she'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing furniture. Patrick Hale. her downstairs neighbor, the man who had recommended Aldo's to her when she'd first moved into the building, who fed her cat during the 2 days she'd once spent in the ER with a double ear infection in both twins simultaneously, who had driven her to the DM Vive twice and waited without complaint. Patrick Hale, who had asked her once, casually, over the terrible coffee, how she'd ended up in this neighborhood, who had asked, also casually, whether she'd ever looked up any of the people from her old life, whether she was in contact with anyone from before the twins, whether she ever thought about the twins' father. She had said no. She'd said it so easily and naturally and completely that she'd never even thought about the question again. "How long?" she said. Her voice came out wrong, thin. "We think he was placed 18 months after you moved into that building." She counted. Did the math. "The twins were 2. "Yes." "Someone tracked me down when my children were 2 years old." "We think Creel's operation identified you about 6 months before Patrick Hale moved in. The insertion was planned. The cover was thorough." Damien's voice was very even. The evenness cost him something. She could see that, the effort of delivering this without the anger she could feel sitting under his surface. "He's been reporting your movements, your schedule, your associations, the restaurant." A pause. "He's the one who told them which night you were working when I walked in." The room was very still. Serafina looked at the photograph in her hand. Patrick Hale getting out of a car she didn't recognize, on a street she didn't recognize, talking to someone whose face was partially out of frame. Just another moment in a life she'd thought was ordinary. "He knew," she said. "He knew who I was, what my connection to you was." "Yes." "For 5 years." "Yes." She put the photograph down on the desk, set it down carefully, precisely, the way Ivy stacked napkins. The careful deliberateness of someone who needed to control at least one thing in the room. She looked at the photograph for another moment, and then she turned away from it and walked to the window where Damien had been standing, and she looked out at the Black River. "The person who sent that text," she said, 5 years ago, the one that said, 'Stop, I made my choice.' We believe Creel's organization was already embedded in my father's network by then. The man I mentioned this morning, the one who died, he may have been working 2 sides. Using your disappearance to destabilize me during the Caruso conflict and simultaneously feeding information to Creel about my operation." He paused. "Creel's been building a picture of me for years, acquiring leverage, and the one piece of leverage no amount of territory or money could buy him was us," she said. "Yes." She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, she could make out the shapes of men positioned at the perimeter of the property. Guards. Damien's people. The world she'd been so carefully keeping her children away from, wrapped around them now like walls. "Patrick has a key to my building," she said. "I know, He has a key to my apartment." She turned around. "He's watched my children. He sat with them. Rowan called him Uncle Pat until he was 4 years old, and I made him stop because it felt..." She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "It felt presumptuous. That's the word I used. Presumptuous." She laughed, short and hard and terrible. "He was in my home. He knows their school. He knows their schedule, their teachers' names. He knows that Rowan is allergic to tree nuts and that Ivy has a loose tooth. Serafina." Damien crossed the room, stopped a few feet from her. "They're here. They're safe." "They're not safe." She said it with complete flatness. "My children have never been safe. I thought I was building them a safe life, and I was living on top of a trap for 5 years, and I didn't see it." She looked at him. "I didn't see it." He didn't offer her comfort. She would have hated him for it. Instead, he held her gaze and let her feel the full shape of it without rushing her through to the other side. And that was something. That was him. "What does Creel want?" she asked. "He wants me to pull back from the Hudson waterfront operations. 3 piers, specifically. They're critical to a shipping route he's been trying to establish for 2 years. I've been blocking him." Damien's voice had gone flat and operational. "He's calculated that the fastest way to move me is not direct conflict. It's leverage. Taking something that matters more than the piers. The children. You and the children." "Yes." She absorbed this, all of it. The years of it, the architecture of it, the meticulous patience of a man she'd never met who had looked at her life and seen a pressure point and quietly, carefully built his hand around it. "How did you know to get us out tonight?" she asked. "You saw the SUV?" "I saw the SUV. And when my man ran the plate and it came back to a Creole shell company, I knew we had hours, not days." He looked at her steadily. "I had been watching for it. After what you told me this morning, about the text, about the timing, I made some calls. Some people in my organization went back through old records." His expression shifted. "What they found is worse than I told you." She waited. "The Creole organization didn't just facilitate your disappearance from my life. They've been actively monitoring this situation for years, waiting to use it. But 3 weeks ago, when they made their move against my waterfront operations, and I pushed back harder than they expected, something changed on their end." He stopped. "We intercepted a communication. They weren't planning to use you as passive leverage anymore. They were planning to move on you directly. Take the children as a demonstration." The word demonstration hit her somewhere below language. "When?" she asked. "The communication was dated 8 days ago." 8 days. She did the math again. "You found me 4 days ago." "Yes." She looked at him. The thing she was feeling was too large and too structural to be called any single emotion. It was more like the moment a building's frame fails, when everything that seems solid reveals itself as contingent. "You walked into that restaurant by accident," she said slowly. "But if you hadn't, they had 4 more days." He said it quietly. "Maybe less." The room held that. Serafina walked to the nearest chair and sat down. Not because her legs were giving out this time, but because standing felt like the wrong shape for what she was carrying. She sat, and she put her hands on her knees, and she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the technique she'd taught herself in the hospital, the night the twins were born, when she'd been alone and terrified and had needed something mechanical to hold on to. "Tell me about Creole," she said. "What do you need to know?" "Everything, all of it. Don't calibrate for me." She looked up at him. "I'm done being managed." He sat down across from her. And he told her. It took 40 minutes. Damien talked in the careful, exact way of someone accustomed to briefing people on things with consequences. And she listened without interrupting, cataloging details with the part of her brain that had always been better at systems than she'd let on. The part that had been running threat assessments since the children were born, that had kept them alive and invisible through 5 years of careful calculation, that was already, even now, beginning to map what he was telling her onto what she knew. Victor Creole, 61 years old, legitimate front of commercial real estate along the northeastern seaboard, actual operation in freight and maritime transport of things that didn't appear on manifests. 3 warehouses in South Boston, 2 in Providence, working contacts in the port of Newark. Had spent 12 years building influence in federal and municipal law enforcement through a targeted campaign of strategic favors. Had never been indicted. Had been investigated twice and walked both times because the evidence had a tendency to become unavailable. Ruthless not in the theatrical way, not through violence for its own sake, but in the precise, considered way of someone who viewed people as variables in an equation, who didn't break things he could instead redirect. "He's smart," Damien said. "Smarter than most of the people I've dealt with. He doesn't overreach. He waits." "He waited 5 years on us," Serafina said. "He's been waiting 12 on me." She looked at him. "You've been in his sights for 12 years. Since I was 23. Since before I met you." He held her gaze. "When I told you earlier that what happened between us was someone in my father's network feeding information to Creole, it's more specific than that. Creole didn't just benefit from our separation. He engineered it. He identified you as a vulnerability before I even knew you were pregnant. He moved to neutralize the vulnerability." The geometry of it settled over her like something physical. She had been 22 years old, newly pregnant and in love and frightened, and a 60-year-old man in Boston had looked at her and seen a liability to be managed. "He didn't know about the twins," she said. "Not until recently. You hid well." Something moved through his expression. Not quite pride. Something more complicated. When Hale confirmed what he'd found, that there were 2 children and not 1. Creel revised his assessment. 2 children are more useful than 1. The leverage compounds. She felt sick. She held it down. "What's your plan?" she said. He looked at her. "I'm going to end it." "That's not a plan. That's an intention. The plan is more specific than I can give you tonight. Some of it I don't have yet." He leaned forward slightly. "But I need something from you." "What?" "Patrick Hale doesn't know you're gone yet. He'll check in the morning. He has a pattern every 2 or 3 days. And when he finds the apartment empty, he'll flag it to Creel. That gives us somewhere between 12 and 20 hours before Creel knows the play has changed." He held her gaze. "I need you to go back." The sentence sat in the air. "Say that again," she said. "I need you to go back to the apartment. With the kids. Act normal. Give me the time I need to set something up on the other end." She stared at him. "You want to use me as bait. I want to use the appearance of normalcy as cover. There's a difference. The difference is academic when my children are in that apartment." "The children won't be in the apartment." His voice was steady. "They'll appear to be. My people will be in position. Hale won't be able to get close enough to confirm. No." She said it once, clean. "I will not put my children in a manufactured situation involving people with guns. I don't care how controlled the variables are. No." He absorbed this. She watched him recalibrate. "Then I need another 12 hours, he said, "to get eyes on Creel's operation in Newark without tipping the timeline. If Hale flags us before I have that, then figure out how to do it faster." "Serafina." "I said no, Damien." She stood. "I understand the operational logic. I understand what you're trying to do. I'm telling you I won't do it with my children as props, and that is a fixed point. Work around it." He stood too. They were close in the room, closer than they'd been in the coffee shop, closer than the restaurant, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in him, the pressure of something that had been building for 12 years pressing against the composure he wore like a second skin. "I'm trying to protect them," he said, very quietly. "So am I." She held his gaze. "We're just doing it differently. Your way leaves me blind for longer. Your way puts them in the middle. They're already in the middle." He said it with a kind of terrible gentleness. "Creel put them in the middle 5 years before either of us had any say in it. I'm not asking you to like it. I'm asking you to help me end it." The study was very quiet. Outside, the river moved in the dark. She was about to answer, had the shape of the answer in her mouth, the refusal dressed in something more reasoned this time, when the door opened. One of Damien's men, the one from the restaurant, big and quiet. He looked at Damien, and the look had a shape to it that reached across the room and changed the temperature. "We have a problem," the man said. Damien looked at him. "Hale made contact with Creel's people 20 minutes ago." The man held out a phone. Damien's, clearly, showing a message. He didn't wait for morning. Something tipped him. Serafina felt the floor shift under the sentence. "What tipped him?" Damien asked. "The second SUV. When we pulled our tail off to bring the family here, Creel's people noticed the shift. Hale got a call asking him to confirm." The man paused. "He confirmed. He told them the apartment was dark when he checked at 9. Serafina looked at Damien. "He checked at 9, she said. "We left at 7:30. 90-minute window." Damien's jaw was tight. "Creel knows we're mobile." "Does he know we're here?" "Not yet." He looked at his man. "Get Reyes and Torres on the South Access Road. I want the riverside covered with 2 more. He looked back at Serafina. "We have a few hours, maybe less." She looked at him, at the photograph of Victor Creel still lying on the desk, at the folder of 5 years of her life catalogued and surveilled and reduced to intelligence by people she'd never met. Patrick Hale had sat at her kitchen table. He had watched Rowan blow out candles on a birthday cake. He had held Ivy when she was sick with fever and Serafina's arms had been too tired. She walked to the desk, picked up the photograph of Victor Creel, looked at the heavy, patient face, the face of a man who had looked at her children and seen leverage. "I'll do it," she said. Damien went still. "Not the apartment. Not with the kids in it." She set the photograph down. "But whatever else you need. Whatever it takes to get him exposed and buried." She looked up. I have information. 5 years of a life that was being watched. I know what I talked about with Patrick, what I gave him, what he saw. I know what Creel thinks he knows about this family. She held Damien's gaze. Use that. Use me. He looked at her for a long moment. I need you to understand what you're agreeing to, he said. I need you to understand that I've been protecting these children alone for 5 years, and I'm very tired of doing it in the dark. She kept her voice level. Put me in the light. Let me do something that matters. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, or hadn't seen in so long it took her a moment to name it. Not the operational focus, not the controlled grief of the coffee shop, something older, something from before. He was about to speak when his phone went off. Not a message, a call. He looked at the screen and something happened in his face, a flash of something cold and total, and he answered it and listened and said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he hung up. Damien, she said. They move faster than I thought. His voice was very flat. Creel's people are at the children's school. The world narrowed to a single point. The school is closed, she said. It's 9 at night. They're not there now. They were there today. During school hours. He looked at her. They have photographs of the children, Rowan and Ivy, outside the school gates. He paused. Creel sent them to my phone 10 minutes ago, which means he also has this number, which means someone else in my organization. But Serafina was already moving toward the door, toward the stairs, toward the room where her children. The door to the children's room was exactly as she'd left it, pulled mostly closed, the thin line of hallway light across the floor. She pushed it open and stood in the doorway and looked at them. Rowan on the top bunk, one arm hanging off the side, breathing the deep, even breath of someone who had no idea the world was reconfiguring itself around him. Ivy on the bottom, curled toward the wall, her hair spread across the pillow. Serafina stood there for 10 seconds, counted her own heartbeat. Let the sight of them do what it always did, burn through the panic and leave something harder and colder underneath. Damien appeared in the hallway behind her. They're asleep, she said quietly. Good. How did Creel get your number? Working on it. She turned, kept her voice below the level that would reach through the door. Someone in your organization is talking to him right now. Someone who knows where we are. Not where we are. They know I pulled you out. They don't have this address. You're certain? I'm certain of 3 people. That's who knows this location. His jaw was set. One of them is me. Who are the other 2? Reyes and Marcus. Both have been with me for 8 years. 8 years is enough time to turn someone. He looked at her. I know that. Then we can't assume I know that, Serafina. Not sharp, just waited. The look of someone who understood the math and didn't need her to show her work. I've been running this calculation since the moment my phone lit up. We have maybe 4 hours before light. I need to use them. He turned. Come downstairs. She looked back at the children once more. Then she pulled the door to and followed him. The main floor of the house had become something different in the past 30 minutes. 2 more men she hadn't seen before appeared from somewhere, the basement or the grounds, were at the long table in what had been a dining room, laptops open, a city map spread under a weighted coffee cup. Reyes was on the phone in the corner, speaking low and fast in a language she didn't catch. Marcus, she identified him by elimination, a compact man in his 40s with a scar along his left jaw, was standing at the window with his arms crossed and his eyes on the dark property outside. Damien went to the table. She followed. On the laptop screen, a satellite image of a waterfront facility. She recognized the general geography, Lower Brooklyn, the industrial stretch south of Red Hook, where the piers ran into each other in the dark like broken teeth. Creel's people are based out of a freight terminal at Pier 41, Damien said. We've had eyes on it for 3 weeks. He uses it for legitimate freight during business hours. After hours, it's something else. He pointed at the image. This building here, the operations center, control room on the 3rd floor. He runs his communications out of there when he's in the city. Is he in the city? He flew in this morning. Damien looked at her. Which means he wasn't planning to wait. He came to manage the endgame personally. She looked at the image, the terminal. the long dark shape of the pier against the black water. What's the plan? Two-part. Reyes takes a team to the terminal at 0200. Their job is to get into the operations center and pull Creel's communication files, encrypted drives, physical records, whatever's there. That material goes to a federal contact I've been building a relationship with for 2 years, an organized crime unit out of the Southern District. He paused. A man named Harlan Cole. He's been building a case against Creel for 4 years and losing it every time because the evidence disappears. I give him evidence that can't disappear, pulled from inside Creel's own operation. And Creel is done. Federally done. The kind of done you don't come back from. She absorbed this. And the second part? Me. He said it simply. I go to Creel directly. Tonight. I tell him I know about the school. I tell him I know about Hale. And I tell him that if he moves on my family before the federal case lands, the information I'm giving Cole expands to include every name in his organization from Boston to Newark. You're using yourself as a distraction. I'm buying Reyes time to get into the terminal. You're walking into a room with a man who has spent 12 years planning to neutralize you. Yes. She looked at him. The lamp on the table threw hard shadows under his eyes, along his jaw, made him look like something carved rather than grown. She thought about what it cost to be this calm about a thing like that. Thought about what kind of years had built that particular composure. He'll try to kill you, she said. He'll try to use me first. He wants the peers more than he wants me dead. Dead men don't sign over territory. A pause. He'll negotiate, and while he's negotiating, Reyes gets the drives. And if the negotiation ends before Reyes gets out, he didn't answer. Damien. Then the federal material goes to Cole regardless. It's already been partially transferred, enough to open the case. I just won't be available to testify. He said it with the flat pragmatism of someone describing weather. She stood very still. That, she said carefully, is not an acceptable outcome. It's an acceptable risk. Not to me. Serafina, don't. She stepped closer to the table, closer to him. You have 2 children asleep upstairs who have never met their father. You do not get to walk into a room and choose to be expendable. That is not... She stopped, organized herself. That is not what's going to happen. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression had shifted. The operational surface cracked slightly, showing something underneath that was less controlled. Then tell me what you want to happen, he said. I want to help. No. You haven't heard what I'm offering. I don't need to. You are staying in this house with the children, and Patrick Hale trusts me. She said it flat and fast, cutting across the refusal before it could finish forming. I have 5 years of a relationship with him. He doesn't know what I know now. As far as he understands it, I am still the woman who accepted his help and trusted him and had no idea what he was. She held Damien's gaze. If I contact him tonight, if I tell him I'm frightened, that I don't know where to go, that I need his help, he'll tell Creel. And Creel will think I'm in the wind, alone, scared, not here, not with you. Silence. It buys your team time, she said. Real time, not ours. It changes what Creel thinks he's working with. He'll redirect resources to finding me. He'll pull back from the terminal while he looks. Marcus had turned from the window. She could feel Reyes off the phone now, listening. You'd be feeding Creel a false trail, Damien said slowly. I'd be feeding Hale a false trail. Hale feeds Creel. That's how the chain works, right? Hale is the relay. She kept her voice even. I know how to talk to Patrick. I know exactly what he needs to hear to believe I'm falling apart. I've been performing ordinary for him for 5 years. One more performance. Damien looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something behind his eyes was working through it. The risk calculation, the operational logic. The other thing underneath that wasn't operational at all. If he suspects, he said, even slightly, he won't. You can't know that. I know him. I've watched him operate for 5 years, even if I didn't understand what I was watching. I know how he reads people. I know his tells. She took a breath. Let me do this. It's the one thing I can do that none of your people can. He doesn't trust them. He trusts me. Damien was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Reyes. Reyes gave a small nod. The nod of someone who'd run the numbers and agreed with them. All right, Damien said, quietly and without happiness. We do it your way. She called Patrick Hale at 11:47, 3 rings before he answered, which meant he'd been awake. She sat at the kitchen table with Damien standing 6 feet away and Marcus and Reyes at the edge of the room, and she held the phone to her ear and became the woman Patrick Hale had known for 5 years, the tired, resilient, slightly overwhelmed single mother who asked for help just rarely enough to make each ask feel like a real concession. Pat. She put the right amount of frayed into her voice. Not too much. I'm sorry to call this late. Sarah. His voice was warm. It had always been warm. She understood now what that warmth had cost him, the maintenance of it, the years of careful performance, and she filed the understanding away and used it. Is everything okay? No, not really. A pause timed to feel like swallowed pride. I had a situation tonight, and I don't know where I am, Pat. I took the kids and I just drove and I'm parked somewhere near, I don't even know. It's off the parkway somewhere. Slow down. Are the kids okay? They're asleep in the back seat. They don't know. A breath. There was a man at the restaurant tonight. I recognized him. From before. From when the kids were born. She put fear into it. Real fear. Because she had enough real fear in her to borrow from, and it came through as exactly the right frequency. He found me, Pat. I don't know how, but he found me and I panicked and I grabbed the kids and I don't know what to do. A beat of silence. She felt it. The slight recalibration happening on his end, the relay clicking into motion. Okay, he said. Okay, listen, don't go back to the apartment tonight. I'll come find you. Tell me roughly where you are. I'm near the parkway, I said. Off? I saw signs for something in Jersey, I think. Maybe take the next exit you see and text me the cross streets. I'll come to you. The warmth had sharpened slightly, the way a tool sharpens when it finds its use. You did the right thing calling me. I didn't know who else to call, she said. She hung up and set the phone on the table and looked at her hands. Damien crossed the room and sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He looked at her face and she looked at his, and there was something in the room between them that neither of them found the words for. He'll call Creel within 10 minutes, she said. He'll tell him I'm mobile, scared, in New Jersey somewhere. Creel will shift resources to find me. She paused. You have a window. Damien nodded once, looked at Reyes. Move up the timeline. Reyes was already moving. The next hour and a half was the specific torture of enforced waiting. Serafina went upstairs twice to check the children, came back down, drank water she didn't taste, watched Damien at the table with Marcus, going over something on the laptop with the focused intensity of people for whom waiting was an active practice, not a passive one. At 12:40, Reyes checked in. Inside the perimeter, 2 guards on the east side, 1 at the main entry. Standard rotation. At 1:15, moving toward the operations building. At 1:32, nothing. Damien watched his phone with complete stillness. Marcus stood by the window. The house was quiet except for the settling sounds and the distant sound of the river. At 1:41, the phone buzzed. Damien read the message and something left his shoulders. They're in, he said. She exhaled. How long for the drives? 20 minutes if nothing goes wrong. Nothing went wrong for 17 minutes. At 1:58, 3 things happened in rapid sequence. The phone on the table, not Damien's, the secondary phone they'd been monitoring, lit up with an intercept. One of Damien's people listening to Creel's communications had caught something and flagged it. Damien read it and stood up very fast. Marcus at the window said, "Car on the access road." And from upstairs, clearly and impossibly, Serafina heard Rowan cry out. Not the sound of a nightmare. A different sound, sharp, cut off. She was moving before the sound finished, up the stairs at a dead run, the door to the children's room hitting the wall as she came through it. Rowan was sitting up in the top bunk with his hand pressed to his mouth, eyes wide, and he was fine, startled awake, some dream. But the bottom bunk was empty. The sheets were pushed back. The pillow still held the shape of a small head. Ivy was gone. Serafina stood in the doorway for 1 second that lasted the length of her entire life. Then she turned and screamed Damien's name. He was in the doorway in 4 seconds. He looked at the empty bunk. Something happened in his face that she had no name for. Something seismic. Something that broke through every layer of the composure she'd been watching him maintain. And then it was gone, sealed back, replaced with something colder and more deliberate than anything she'd seen in him yet. "The window," he said. She crossed the room. The window at the far side of the children's room faced the back property, the slope toward the river. It was open 2 inches, no screen. The latch had been pushed from the outside. From the outside. Someone had been in the house. Someone had been inside the perimeter, inside the walls, inside the room where her children were sleeping, and she had been downstairs performing calm on a telephone call while… Damien. Her voice had gone somewhere she didn't recognize. Someone was in this room. He had the phone to his ear. Speaking quietly, rapidly. She heard Rhea's name, heard the pier, heard 3 words that landed in her chest like something physical. They have her. She turned to face him. He lowered the phone. "Creel's people were never at the terminal tonight," he said. His voice was very quiet. "The terminal was a secondary play. The primary play was here." He paused. "We were misdirected. The intercept we got 30 minutes ago, we were meant to intercept it. It was designed to make us think the terminal was the target." He looked at her. "The terminal was bait. This house was the operation." The room tilted. "Someone told them where we were," she said. "Yes." "The 3 people who knew this location." He didn't answer. "Damien." She crossed the room and got close to him, close enough that he had to look directly at her. "Who told them?" He looked at her, and she watched him absorb something. Watched him hold the weight of a betrayal that was going to have a name, a face, 8 years of history behind it. Watched him do it without collapsing under it. "Marcus?" he said. She turned. The doorway was empty. Marcus was gone. From downstairs came the sound of a door, then a car engine starting in the dark below. Then the sound of it pulling away fast down the access road, and then nothing but the river and the silence and Rowan's frightened breathing from the top bunk. Damien was already moving. She followed him, the 2 of them on the stairs, and she was running on something that wasn't adrenaline anymore, something older, colder, the specific fuel of a mother who has had something taken from her and intends to take it back. "Where would they go?" she said. Not a question, a demand. "The terminal." He grabbed his jacket from the hall, phone in hand. "That's where Creel is. That's where he'll take her. He wants me there, on his ground, where he controls the variables." "Then that's where we go." He looked at her. 1 second, 2. "You're not… She is my daughter." She said it without volume, but with everything underneath it. "You are not leaving me here." He held her gaze. Then he turned and called for Reyes. The drive to Brooklyn took 22 minutes. Serafina sat in the back of the SUV with Rowan pressed against her side. She'd brought him because leaving him in that house was not a category of option she could access. And Damien was in the front with Reyes and 2 other men, phone against his ear, assembling something fast and necessary that she could only partially follow. She kept her hand on Rowan's back. He was rigid with the particular tension of a child who understood that something was very wrong and was choosing not to ask about it because asking made it more real. "Rowan," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "What do you know?" "Ivy." A pause. "Someone took Ivy." She pressed her hand flat between his shoulder blades. "We're going to get her." "I know," he said again. And like his sister 2 hours earlier in a different room in a different crisis, he said it with a certainty that had no business living in a 7-year-old. But it was there, absolute and unshakable. She held him against her and watched Brooklyn approach through the windshield, the industrial dark of it, the lights of the bridge reflected in the water, the long black shapes of the waterfront piers. And she thought about Ivy's face, the way she stood in doorways and observed rooms before entering them. The way she'd said, "I see more than you think I do," with just her eyes, in that restaurant, watching a stranger who didn't know yet that he was her father. Ivy, who was somewhere in that dark terminal with a man who looked at children and saw leverage. The SUV turned onto the pier road, and the headlights went off, and they moved in darkness, and Serafina's heart was a fist opening and closing in her chest, steady and brutal and relentless. And she looked at Damien's profile in the dark front seat, jaw tight, eyes forward, every line of him compressed into something singular and purposeful. And she thought, this is what he is. This is the thing she'd been afraid of. The man who walked toward terrible things without slowing down. She thought, good. The terminal materialized out of the dark ahead of them. The long, low buildings, the loading cranes standing against the sky like enormous birds, the security lights throwing yellow pools across the concrete. 2 vehicles were parked near the main building, a light in the 3rd floor window. Reyes stopped the car. Damien turned to look at her. In the dark, his face was shadow and intention. "Stay with the car," he said. "No." "Serafina, tell me the layout, 3rd floor. What's up there besides the control room?" A pause. He looked at her for one more second. Then he looked at Reyes. Reyes said quietly, "Freight office on the north side. Connects to a maintenance stairwell that comes up through the east loading bay. It's not monitored. It was supposed to be, but the camera's been down for 3 weeks." She looked at Damien. "While you go through the front, while you have Creel's attention." He was very still. "You go in the front and you give him what he wants," she said. "His audience, his confrontation, his 12 years of building to this moment." She held his gaze. "And I go through the east bay and I find my daughter." Outside, somewhere in the terminal, the light moved in the 3rd floor window. A figure crossing the room, briefly visible, then gone. Damien reached past her and opened the door. "Reyes goes with you," he said. "You do not go anywhere in that building without Reyes. You hear something, you see something. You do not move until—" "Damien, I mean it. I hear you." She met his eyes. "Come back." He looked at her. The thing in his face was not the composure she'd been watching all night. It was underneath the composure. The thing the composure was built to protect. She saw it clearly for the first time, clean and unguarded in the second, before he turned away. He got out of the car, straightened his jacket, walked toward the main entrance of the terminal without looking back, and the darkness took him, and the door closed. Serafina looked at Rowan. "You stay in this car," she said. "You do not move. You do not open this door for anyone who isn't me or your father." Rowan stared at her. "My father." She had said it, out loud, in the dark in a car outside a freight terminal on a Brooklyn pier. After 5 years of the word living only in the locked room, she never opened. She looked at her son's gray eyes. "We'll talk about it when this is over," she said. She got out of the car. The cold hit her face. The pier smelled of salt and diesel and the specific cold of river water in December. Reyes materialized beside her, compact, professional, a gun in a shoulder holster that she was aware of without looking at directly. "East Bay," she said. "East Bay," he confirmed. They moved through the dark toward the terminal's edge, keeping to the shadow of the building, the concrete wet under their feet, the cranes overhead enormous and still. Behind them, the car sat dark and quiet with Rowan inside it. Ahead, the maintenance stairwell door was a black rectangle in the building's side. From somewhere above them, 3rd floor, the lit window, a voice carried down through the winter air. Damien's voice. Then another, lower, older, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who believed he had all the time in the world. Creole. Reyes reached the door, tested it. It gave. Serafina followed him into the dark of the building and let the door close behind her, and the sounds from outside went to nothing, and she stood for a moment in the absolute black of the stairwell while her eyes adjusted and her heart did what her heart did, and she breathed. 1 floor up. Ivy was up there somewhere. She started climbing. The stairwell smelled of rust and cold concrete and something chemical underneath, cleaning fluid or fuel, she couldn't tell. Serafina climbed in the dark with her hand on the wall, and Reyes 2 steps ahead of her, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this particular kind of thing before and had made a private peace with it. She had not made any kind of peace with it. She climbed on instinct and on the sound of her daughter's name repeating in the back of her skull like something with a heartbeat. First landing, a door. Reyes held up a hand. She stopped. He listened, pushed the door open an inch. A corridor, dim, empty. Freight office to the left, dark. He shook his head. Second floor. Not here. She followed him up. Second landing. Another door. Through this one, faint. Voices. Not words yet, just the shape of them. The rhythm of two men in a room above her. One of them, Damien. The other one, older, measured, with the patience of someone who had been waiting 12 years for this particular conversation. Reyes stopped, turned to her, held up two fingers and pointed at the ceiling, then made a flat hand gesture she interpreted as stay level, move lateral. There was a door at the far end of this corridor that connected to the North Freight office, which would put them directly below the control room. He'd mapped this before. She understood that and felt a pulse of something that wasn't quite gratitude, something more functional than that. She nodded. They moved. The corridor was 40 feet of painted concrete with a line of dead fluorescent fixtures overhead, and a single working security light at the far end throwing everything into blue-gray shadow. Midway down, a door on the right side stood open. Through it, stacked pallets, the smell of cardboard and something organic, a high narrow window that showed the pier lights outside. She passed it without slowing. The door at the end opened into the freight office. Filing cabinets, a desk with a dead computer, a coat rack with nothing on it. Reyes moved to the interior wall, the shared wall with the building's core, and pressed his ear against it. She did the same. Above them, through the floor, Damien's voice, clearer now. Didn't come here to negotiate territory. You already know that. A pause. Then Creel. She heard him for the first time without the distance of a surveillance photograph or second-hand account, and the reality of him was less theatrical than she'd constructed. He sounded like a man at a business lunch, comfortable, in possession of all the relevant information. You came here because I have something of yours, Creel said. Let's not dress it up. Where is she? She's fine. She's been fine for the past 40 minutes. No one's touched her. A pause. I want you to understand something, Damien. I'm not a man who hurts children. That's not who I am. She's a means to an end, and she's been treated accordingly. She's in the next room eating crackers. Serafina pressed her palm flat against the wall. Eating crackers. She felt it move through her. Something enormous and complicated. Relief and fury, and the specific violence of a mother who has been managing terror for the past hour. And she breathed through it, slow and deliberate, until it condensed into something she could use. Reyes had found a hatch in the ceiling of the freight office. A maintenance access, square and metal, the kind of thing that existed in industrial buildings for reasons no one currently alive had documented. He was looking at it, then at her, with the expression of someone doing a weight calculation. She pointed up. He shook his head slightly, pointed to himself, then pointed to the door, the corridor, the main stairs, the front of the building where Damien had gone in. She understood. He was going to come up through the main stairs, come in through the front of the control room. She was going to go up through the hatch. She held his gaze for a moment. He reached up and pushed the hatch open with barely a sound. He laced his hands together. She put her foot in them. She went up through the ceiling. The crawl space above the freight office was 18 inches of dark and insulation and pipework. She moved on her forearms and knees in the direction of the voices, which were louder up here. She was between floors now, the control room's subfloor directly above her, and she could hear everything. The piers, Creel was saying. 3 piers. That's all this has ever been about. You give me clear operation on Pier 38, 39, and 41 for a period of 5 years with no interference from your organization, and we're done. The child goes home, you go home, everything else, the history, the details, all of that becomes irrelevant. You had a man in my organization for 8 years. Damien's voice. You intercepted my communications 5 years ago. You separated me from my family and then spent 5 years positioning their lives as leverage. And you want to talk to me about peers. I want to talk to you about what's practical. You're not walking out of this building. A pause, longer than the others. I have 4 men on this floor, Creel said. You have yourself. I'd encourage some recalibration. I have more than myself. Serafina found the edge of the subfloor, a seam where the access panel was, latched from below. She pressed her fingers along it in the dark, found the catch, held it. She was directly above the room. She thought about Ivy's loose tooth, the one Creel's surveillance had documented, the one Patrick Hale had mentioned in passing during some ordinary conversation she couldn't now specifically remember. The casualness of it, the way Hale had sat at her table and taken inventory of her daughter's small, unremarkable childhood facts and fed them into a machine that turned them into threat assessments. Her hand tightened on the latch. "I want to see the girl," Damien said. "Before anything else, I want to see her. In good time. Now." The word came out without inflection and landed in the room like a stone into water. "Right now, or this conversation ends." A pause. Then the sound of movement. A door opening. Not the main door, a secondary one, somewhere to the right. Footsteps. Then a smaller set of footsteps, lighter, and something that might have been the particular sound of crackers in a wrapper being set down on a hard surface. "Ivy." Damien's voice changed. Just slightly, just enough. Serafina pushed the latch. The panel dropped and she came through the ceiling. She had one clear second of vision before the room reorganized itself around her arrival. The control room, equipment along the walls, a bank of dead monitors, a central space where two men stood. Damien on one side, an older, heavier man she recognized from the photograph on the other. Two more men against the wall to the right, weapons out, but momentarily fixed on the ceiling where she'd come from, because that was where the noise had come from, and human attention followed noise. And in the far corner, near the secondary door, a man she didn't know holding Ivy's hand with the casual restraint of someone who'd been told to keep a grip and not much else. Ivy saw her. The expression on her daughter's face in that moment, 7 years old, crackers in her other hand, hair loose, wearing her pajamas with the small stars on them, was not the terror Serafina had been bracing to see. It was something more complicated. It was the expression of someone who had been doing what Ivy always did, which was stand very still in a doorway and observe the room and wait for the right moment. The right moment was now. Ivy pulled her hand free. The man reached for her. Ivy dropped flat to the floor. Not panic, not stumbling, completely deliberate, the way a child who had been watching adults navigate difficult rooms. Her entire life understood that small people had options that large people didn't. And she scrambled on hands and knees across the concrete toward her mother while the man's grab closed on empty air. That was when the main door came open and Reyes came through it. What followed was not clean. It was not the way it happened in things designed to be watched. It was fast and loud and crowded with mistakes. One of the men against the wall moved toward Damien. Damien moved first, the consequence of 12 years of being the kind of man who moved first, and there was a sound Serafina felt in her back teeth, and the man went down. Reyes and the second guard collided and went into a bank of equipment, and something expensive broke and the lights flickered. Serafina hit the floor and pulled Ivy against her and covered her daughter's body with her own and made herself as small as the corner allowed, her face pressed into Ivy's hair, and she felt Ivy's hands grab fistfuls of her shirt and hold on with the specific desperate strength of a child who had been maintaining composure for an hour in a room full of strangers and was now done maintaining it. "Mama," Ivy said, into her shirt. Just that. "I'm here," Serafina said. "I've got you. Don't move." Victor Creel had not moved. She could see him from the corner. He'd stepped back from the center of the room when it came apart, a tactical withdrawal. The movement of a man who had not personally done violence in 20 years, but had not forgotten the geometry of it. He had something in his hand. He was looking not at the fight, but at Damien, tracking him through the chaos with the focused attention of a man who understood that everything else in the room was secondary to one variable. Damien had reached him. They were 3 feet apart. The room had gone to a particular kind of stillness. Reyes and the guard at the wall, both spent, the other man on the floor, the secondary doorman somewhere behind her making no further moves because Reyes had a gun, and the geometry of the room had shifted completely. Just Damien and Creel in the cleared center, the thing in Creel's hand. 12 years, Damien said. He was breathing hard. There was blood on his jaw from somewhere. A cut, not a wound, though his left side moved like something hurt. "You've been in my life for 12 years, and I have never once put a face to it until now." Creel looked at him. The boardroom patience had thinned. Underneath it was something older. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of fear. The recognition that the variables had shifted past his management. "The drives," he said. "Whatever your man pulled from this building tonight, it's encrypted. You can't—" "It's already with Harlan Cole." Damien said it simply. "Whatever's on them or not on them. Cole has enough from what I've given him separately over the past 2 years to open the federal case. Tonight just finishes it." Creel went very still. "There is no version of this where you leave this building and resume operations," Damien said. "That's done. What I'm deciding right now is what happens in this room." "Damien," Serafina said it from the corner. He didn't turn around, but something in his shoulders changed. She saw it, at the sound of her voice. "What you do in this room is something your kids grow up knowing about," she said. "Think about that." The room held that for a long moment. Creel's expression had settled into something she hadn't expected. Acceptance. Not the noble kind. The pragmatic kind. The settling of a man who had run his calculations and arrived at the end of them. He set the thing in his hand down on the nearest surface. Stepped back. Reyes moved. The rest of it was procedural. She didn't watch it. She sat in the corner of the control room of a pier terminal in Brooklyn at 2 a.m. with her daughter in her arms and Ivy's hands still clenched in her shirt, and she watched the river through the high window, a thin line of black water visible between the cranes, and she breathed. Damien crossed the room and crouched down in front of them. His face was a wreck. The cut on his jaw, exhaustion stamped so deep into the lines around his eyes, it looked geological. He looked at Ivy. Ivy looked at him. "Those were bad crackers," Ivy said. Something cracked open in Damien's face. Not the composure. The thing underneath the composure that she'd seen in the car outside. He pressed his hand briefly over his eyes. Then he lowered it and looked at his daughter. Looked at her with the full force of everything the night had been. And Ivy, with the unsettling perceptiveness she'd had since she could hold her head up, reached out and put her small hand on his arm. "It's okay," she said. He covered her hand with his. Didn't speak for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, it is." Rowan was still in the car when they got back to it. Serafina had been half convinced, the whole walk back across the terminal, that he'd done something characteristically Rowan about being left alone. Gotten out, investigated something, wandered in the wrong direction. But the car door opened, and there he was, exactly where she'd left him, sitting with his knees pulled up and his arms around them, and the expression of someone who had spent an hour conducting an internal negotiation about whether to trust his mother's last instruction. He saw Ivy first. He unfolded himself from the back seat and grabbed her by both shoulders and then pulled her into the kind of rough, graceless hug that boys gave people when they couldn't say what they meant. Ivy let him, patted him once, firmly on the back. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said, into her hair. Serafina stood outside the car and let them have it. The cold came off the river, and she was aware of Damien standing a few feet behind her, near enough that she could hear him breathe. "Cole's team will move on Creel by morning," he said. "The federal case has been built long enough that the arrest and asset freeze will happen simultaneously. His Boston and Providence operations will be disrupted within 48 hours. A pause. Patrick Hale will be picked up as part of the same sweep." She nodded. "Your building is safe to return to. Our people are already—" "Damien." He stopped. She turned around. He was standing in the pier light, the river behind him, the cranes overhead, and he looked like what he was, a man at the end of something very long who hadn't yet figured out what came after it. "Are you hurt?" she said. He seemed surprised by the question, touched the cut on his jaw. "No, not seriously." "You move like your left side hurts." "Cracked rib, maybe." He paused. "Probably. You need to have that looked at." "I will." They looked at each other. Behind her, Rowan was asking Ivy a question in a low voice, and Ivy was answering with the efficient economy of someone giving a debrief, and the sounds of them, ordinary, alive, bickering lightly over the quality of the crackers, filled the cold air. "I don't know what this looks like," Serafina said. Going forward, I don't know what the shape of it is. Neither do I. That's not reassuring. No, he held her gaze. But I'm not going to pretend I have a plan for it. I don't. I have the fact that they exist, that you exist. And the last 5 years being what they were, and the last 12 hours being what they were. He stopped. Something moved through his expression quietly. I would like the chance to figure out the shape of it. With you. That's what I have. She looked at him for a long moment. You have to dismantle it, she said, not just step back, not manage it from a distance. The organization, the operations, the whole structure of it, it has to go. She said it without apology and held his gaze without blinking. Because I will not raise them inside it. Whatever they are, whatever they've already absorbed from tonight, from the past week, they deserve a life where the person who's supposed to protect them isn't also the reason they need protecting. You understand that? He held her gaze. Yes. It won't be fast. No. And there will be things... She paused. Things you've done that I don't know about and that I'm going to have to decide what to do with when I find out. Yes. I'm not telling you I've decided anything. I'm telling you I'm willing to find out the shape of it. She felt the cold off the river on her face. That's what I have. He looked at her for a long moment. Not with the composure, with the thing underneath it. That's enough, he said. The drive back through Brooklyn was quiet. Both children fell asleep before the bridge, Rowan against the window again, Ivy leaning against her brother's shoulder in the way she never did while awake, but apparently permitted in unconsciousness. Serafina watched them in the dark back seat and felt something very slowly, with a great deal of resistance, begin to let go in her chest. Not all of it, not the 5 years of it, but some. Victor Creel was in federal custody by 6 in the morning. She found out the way she found out most things now. From Damien, directly, in the kitchen of the estate, while the children ate breakfast and the winter sun came through the windows at a low, flat angle and made everything look provisional and strange. The asset freeze had moved fast. His Boston operation had gone quiet by the time the New York arrest was processed. The Providence contact had already retained counsel, which meant he was looking at charges he knew about. Patrick Hale was arrested at his apartment in Lower Manhattan at 5:47 a.m. She had asked Damien to tell her when it happened, and he had. And she had sat with the information for a moment and felt what she felt, which was not satisfaction, or not only satisfaction, but something more complicated. Patrick Hale had fed her children crackers at her table. He had held Ivy in a fever. He had looked her in the eye for 5 years and called her Sarah with the particular warmth of an actor who had been playing a single role for so long he'd stopped being able to separate it from himself. She wondered briefly whether any part of it had been real. Then she decided that wondering was a room she didn't need to spend time in. She had enough rooms to clean out. They went back to the apartment 3 days later. Serafina had considered finding somewhere new, had turned the idea over, tested it, run the calculations the way she ran all calculations now, which was with the added variable of a man who had resources she didn't and opinions he was learning to offer instead of impose. In the end, she'd decided to stay. The apartment was hers. The neighborhood was hers. Marco was there, and the school, and the routines that her children had grown up inside and needed, however strange the recent disruption, like bones needed calcium. She stripped Patrick Hale's key off her ring herself, threw it in the building's dumpster, stood at the dumpster for a moment, key in hand, and then dropped it and went upstairs. The weeks that followed were not clean. Nothing about them was clean or simple or the way things looked in a story that had been organized to deliver catharsis. Damien began the process of withdrawing from his operations with the systematic deliberateness of someone dismantling something that had taken 12 years to build. Not quickly, not without cost, not without days when he was unreachable, and nights when she understood that the thing he was doing had a weight to it that she couldn't share. She didn't try to share it. She did what she'd always done, which was tend to the actual life in front of her, the lunches and the homework and Rowan's ongoing grievance with the universe. And she watched the door at the end of the day, and she let herself do that without punishing herself for it. Damien was introduced to the children's school as their father, not with ceremony, not with a speech. It happened on a Tuesday in February when Serafina had a double shift, and he was the one who picked them up. And Ivy's teacher saw them together and said something polite and routine, and Damien said yes, their father, and that was that. Ivy apparently told her teacher afterwards that her father was very tall, which her teacher had agreed with. Rowan's relationship with Damien developed the way Rowan developed all relationships, with explicit negotiation, frequent testing of limits, and a bedrock of something he would not have named as need, but which was visible to anyone watching from more than 3 feet away. He asked Damien on a Sunday afternoon in March why he hadn't known about them before. Damien had answered him the way Serafina had asked him to. Honestly, without detail that was beyond him, without performing either guilt or absolution. He said that someone had kept them from finding each other, and that it had been a long time before that changed, and that now it was changed. Rowan had absorbed this. Then he'd gone back to his Legos. Then, 10 minutes later, without looking up, "Are you going to live with us?" Damien had looked at Serafina. She'd said, "He's asking you, not me." Damien had looked back at Rowan. "I'd like to. If that's something you'd be okay with, eventually." Rowan had put a piece in place. "Eventually is fine," he said. "I'm not in a rush." Ivy had said nothing. She was drawing at the other end of the table. But Serafina had seen the corner of her mouth move. Spring arrived the way spring arrived in New York. Not gently, not with the clean transition of a calendar page, but incrementally and stubbornly, with cold mornings giving way to afternoons that were almost warm and then back to cold, the city making up its mind over the course of weeks. The snow finally stopped in mid-March. By April, the trees along the block had the particular tentative green of something that had survived something and wasn't entirely sure what to make of it. Harlan Cole's federal case against Victor Creel was confirmed publicly in April. It would take years in the courts. Serafina read the news piece about it on her phone at the bar at Aldo's between the lunch and dinner service and felt, not relief exactly, something that did not have a word for it, or had a word she hadn't found yet, the recognition that a long thing was over. Marco read it over her shoulder and said, "You look like you haven't slept again." "I sleep fine," she said. "You look like a person who sleeps fine but is still carrying something heavy." She looked at him. "When did you get philosophical?" "I've always been philosophical. You've always been too busy to notice." He went back to counting the register. "The man who came in during the snowstorm, he's been picking up your kids." She didn't answer. "He has good eyes," Marco said. "Both the kids have his eyes." He paused. "I'm not prying." "You're absolutely prying. I'm observing. It's different." He looked up. "Are you okay, Sarah?" She thought about the word, rolled it around, considered what it meant, what it had meant 5 years ago, what it might mean now against a different definition of safe. "I'm getting there," she said. One Saturday in late April, she took the children to the waterfront in Hoboken. A small pier with a view of the downtown skyline, benches, a food cart selling things at prices that were highway robbery, and that she bought anyway because Rowan had given her a look. Damien met them there. He'd been held up somewhere. The long process of dismantling had holdups, and she'd learned to expect them without interrogating them. And he arrived 20 minutes late and slightly out of breath, and the children registered this in their respective ways. Rowan with a brief assessment that determined acceptable and went back to his ice cream, Ivy with the corner of the mouth thing. He sat down beside her on the bench. They watched the kids work their way toward the water. Not into it, the railing stopped them, and the skyline sat across the river in the afternoon light, its familiar hard edges softened a little by the season. She was aware of him beside her in the way she'd become aware of him over the past months, as a presence she'd stopped bracing against. Something had changed in her quietly and without ceremony, somewhere between December and April. She couldn't pinpoint the moment. She wasn't sure there was a single moment. There were probably 100 of them, small and unannounced, accumulating the way the snow had accumulated on the night this had begun. "I signed the papers this week," he said, "the last of the waterfront holdings." She looked at him. "Legitimate real estate development, residential and commercial. It'll take 3 years to see returns." He paused. "But it's clean." She held his gaze. 3 years was a long time. It was also not that long. She'd spent 5 years building something out of nothing, and it had held. 3 years of building something clean, with more than nothing to start with. That was survivable. There's a firm, he said carefully, commercial real estate on the development side. They're looking for someone with management experience, the kind of experience that involves, say, handling a 30-cover restaurant service without losing your mind. He looked at her. If you were interested in something with better hours. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not going to be subtle about this, are you? I've found subtlety takes too long. You could have asked me directly. I'm asking you directly. She looked back at the water, at Rowan, who had finished his ice cream and was now explaining something to Ivy, using large gestures that she was listening to with visible patience. The skyline sat in the light. The river moved. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded, didn't push. They sat there for a while, the two of them on the bench in the late April light, watching two children who had gray eyes and a mother's resilience and 5 years of being loved well, navigating the edge of a pier. Ivy crouched down and looked at something in the water. Rowan leaned over the railing and immediately got a sharp word from Serafina that carried across the distance without effort, and he straightened up with the expression of someone who had expected that response and had calculated it was worth it anyway. Damien laughed, quietly, not at full volume, the way people laughed when something caught them without their permission. She looked at him. The laugh was still on his face, not yet gone, and he was watching Rowan with something that was so unguarded, so entirely without the composure she'd spent months watching him maintain, that she found herself looking the way she sometimes found herself looking at the kids when they were asleep, at the fact of them, the sheer improbable fact of them existing and being here and being hers. I have something I want to ask you, he said. The laugh had faded, but not the thing underneath it. She looked at him. Not right now, he said. This isn't the moment. I just want you to know it's coming. He held her gaze. When it comes, it's not going to be about guilt, or about what I owe you, or what time stole from us, or any of the things that have every right to be in the room. He paused. It's just going to be what it is, which is that I love you, which is that I have loved you since before I understood what that meant, and that I would like the rest of the time to mean something different than the last 5 years. She looked at him. The river moved. The light sat on the water. Rowan was now attempting to explain the same thing to Ivy using fewer gestures, having apparently conceded that the large gestures were not working. Ivy listened with her small, serious face and nodded once, and whatever he'd said apparently satisfied something, because she stood up and looked out at the skyline with an expression that was simply content. Serafina took a breath. You should know, she said, that I am very difficult. I know. And that I have 2 children who are also very difficult, in specific and complementary ways. I've noticed. And that I have been alone for a long time, and I've built something from that, and I'm not interested in losing what I built just because the circumstances changed. I'm not asking you to lose anything, he said. I'm asking to be part of what you build next. She looked at him for a long time, at his face in the afternoon light, with the cut on his jaw healed to a faint line and the exhaustion of the winter finally, slowly receding from around his eyes, at the man who had walked into a restaurant during a snowstorm and changed the shape of her life for the second time. She looked at her children at the railing. She thought about the locked room, about what it had held for 5 years, in the dark. She thought about what happened when you opened a room like that, not the damage of it, the air that came in. Ask me, she said. When you're ready, ask me. He looked at her. Something settled in his face, not relief, something quieter and more permanent than relief. The look of someone who had been carrying a thing a long way and had finally set it down in the right place. Across the pier, Rowan called out to her. Something about a boat? He'd seen a boat. It was very big. She needed to see it now, not in a minute now. And she stood up and walked toward them, toward the railing and the river, and her children pointing at something moving on the water. And the skyline of the city stood in the light behind them, and the afternoon held everything in it the way April afternoons sometimes did. The cold still in the shadows, the warmth coming, the long winter not forgotten, but no longer the whole story. She reached the railing, stood between them, put one hand on Rowan's shoulder and one on Ivy's, and looked at the boat, which was indeed very large. I see it, she said. Rowan said something else, already moving on to the next observation, the next thing requiring immediate documentation. Ivy was quiet beside her. Then, in the small, clear voice that had been delivering accurate assessments of the world since she was 4 years old, her daughter said, "He makes you look different." Serafina glanced down at her. "Different how?" Ivy considered, looked at the water. "Like you're not carrying something anymore," she said. "Or like you still are, but it's lighter." Serafina looked at her daughter for a long moment, at the face that held so much that was not hers. The jaw, the eyes, the quality of attention. At the face that was also, completely and irreducibly, entirely its own. "Smart kid," she said. "I know," said Ivy. Behind them, Damien had stood from the bench. He walked over and stood a little apart from them at the railing, looking at the water, and Rowan immediately redirected his boat commentary at him with the relief of someone who had found a more attentive audience. Damien listened, asked a question. Rowan answered at length. Ivy glanced over at them once, assessed the situation, and returned to the river with the expression of someone who had completed a long project and was permitting herself a moment of satisfaction. Serafina kept her hands on the warm metal of the railing and felt the sun on her face and breathed. The river moved south toward the harbor. The city held its shape against the sky. The afternoon light was long and gold and going, the way it went, the way it always went, but slowly, giving everything it passed over a last moment of being seen clearly. The water, the cranes, the bridge, the faces of two children and two people who had found their way back to each other through 5 years of wreckage and patience and the particular stubbornness of things that refused to stop being true. The light held. Then it went. And what remained was still there.